Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. We see a lot of people have registered and many are joining. Indeed, it is a very interesting topic and one that we're all trying to understand a bit better, especially new country examples, how this is being implemented, what are the ramifications, how does it impact our work? So we hope to hear from you as well, interesting questions, your concerns, and have a good discussion. I'll introduce myself. My name is Pilar Salgado. I am a senior private sector specialist at the World Bank. And as a representative of the World Bank, I co-chair the Business Environment Working Group of DCED. So what's the objective of this webinar today? It's to explore the implications of new environmental regulations for developing countries and share the insights from the DCED Business Environment Working Group. To do that, we're launching a report, the new environmental regulations and implications for developing countries. The report was commissioned by DCED and delves into regional and global environmental regulations, especially those from the European Union that have been sort of spearheading these new types of regulations. And it particularly focuses on the impact of the EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and others on their impact on developing economies. The report uses a qualitative approach to this research, including literature reviews, stakeholder interviews, and media analysis. It also presents two case studies, one from Turkey and another one from Ivory Coast, to highlight the practical impacts of these regulations on local economies. We will make the report public towards the end of the presentation. Our colleague Ella will put the link to access it in the chat. So as part of the presentation of the report, we are very glad to be hearing also from our colleagues on Turkey and Peru on their experience navigating CBAM and EUDR in particular. While the report captures part of these experiences, we'll be discussing in particular the impacts to SMEs, the lessons learned, and the benefits of the reforms that aim to align countries to these new regulations. We also will talk about the need for development agencies. We will emphasize the need for development agencies to prioritize more research in this aspect, engage and foster international policy dialogue on this, and provide country-level support for compliance, especially for regulations like EUDR and CBAM. This research is set within a broader set of initiatives undertaken by development partners to address the challenges posed by these regulations. We will have a presentation and our panelists. We really want to hear from you and your questions, and a little bit of housekeeping. You will see to the bottom of your screen that you have in your Zoom chat function, a chat button and a Q&A button. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. The questions go in the Q&A, so that's what will be monitored. Please feel free to put them as the presentations go on, and we'll then collect them and pose them to the panelists and presenters at the end of the session. And I will now introduce our speakers. We are joined by experts from the DCED Business Environment Working Group, as well as speakers with experience in Turkey and Peru, as well as other regions. So our main speaker and researcher is Jana Krajčovićova. She's a business environment specialist and sustainability specialist with over 14 years of experience in policy research, advocacy, program management at the World Bank and in the private sector. Jana's led the DCED research study on new environmental regulations and produced the research and policy note. She's provided insights and recommendations for donors and the development partners. We're also joined by Gülizar Yavaş, the head of the EU Single Market and Green Deal Department at the Turkish Ministry of Trade, where she coordinates the Green Deal Action Plan. Gülizar works closely with public and private stakeholders to advance Turkey's low carbon transition, covering topics such as emissions trading, green finance, sustainable energy, and CBAM. We are also joined by our World Bank colleague, Guillermo Arenas. He's an economist in the Trade and Regional Integration Unit at the World Bank. Guillermo recently led the World Bank's engagement in Peru to support Peru's compliance with EUDR regulations and also to help address supply chain gaps. His expertise spans international trade policy, export competitiveness, fiscal policy analysis using firm-level data. So I thank the panelists and speakers today. And I also, before handing it over, I wanted to give a shout out to our outstanding colleagues from USAID. We hope they are back soon, contributing to the international development community. And without further ado, I would like to pass it on to Jana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilar, and let me join you in welcoming everyone in this webinar. I will share my presentation momentarily, so I hope you can already see the slides on your screen. Today we would like to share the findings of the report and to have topical sections so that we can focus on specific issues like the impact of these regulations on SMEs and on lessons learned. But before we delve into the details, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the global trends in environmental regulations. So while there have been many types of environmental legislation being introduced in the recent years, especially since the Paris Agreement in 2015, one notable development has been the introduction of due diligence legislation. Due diligence legislation introduces due diligence requirements for companies, which are basically a responsibility for them to identify, prevent, and mitigate risks for human rights in a company and its value chains. This was the original definition introduced in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011 and was later refined in the OECD due diligence guidance in 2018. And of course, some of the later variations of due diligence requirements go beyond human rights, as we will see, and include topics such as climate and environment. But let me just say that basically in the report, we identify a rising trend in the due diligence legislation. In 2024, we have a total stock of 34 instruments, mostly legislative instruments, and in a couple of cases, guidelines scattered across regions. 44% of all due diligence legislation has been introduced in Europe, in the European Union, more specifically 29% in North America and 21% in Asia and Pacific. So we see that even though the EU has been a leader in this field, it's a global trend. Most of the requirements are due diligence requirements. In some cases, the legislation focuses on the first part, which is the transparency and disclosure requirements. And in terms of the topics, yes, most of these instruments include provisions on the protection of human rights and labor rights. But as there is also an increasing trend of including environmental and climate provisions, and almost half of the instruments already contains such provisions. So this global trend towards compulsory due diligence legislation and away from voluntary schemes is a result of multiple factors. One has been the questionable effectiveness of some of the voluntary schemes. But we would like to now focus on the case of the EU, which is really setting a legislative precedent on a global scale, something that has been triggered strongly by the EU Green Deal. In the report, we have focused mainly on three pieces of legislation that are very likely and already impacting the trade and competitiveness of emerging and developing economies. And these are the EU Deforestation Regulation, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. As we see, these are not the only instruments introduced by the EU, but these are really the most discussed right now for different reasons. And one is that they are starting to apply very soon. So the EUDR is being rolled out starting at the end of 2025, the CBAM early 2026, and CSDDD, the due diligence directive, will be rolled out in the course of 2027. So before we proceed with the presentation, we would like to check a little bit with you, or with all the participants who are online with us today, and have a better idea of your interactions with this type of legislation. So we would like to launch a polling exercise. And I hope that Ella can actually launch it. So there are two questions that we wanted to ask you. The first one is, how familiar are you with environmental regulations affecting developing countries, such as EUDR, CBAM, CSDDD? So you can choose from three answers: very familiar, somewhat familiar, and not familiar. And the second one is, which regulation has or will have likely or already has the biggest impact on the country or the sector that you are working in? So if you can take a moment to answer these questions. Maybe we can take a couple of seconds. If you can just click the answer, and then Ella can summarize the results for us, or perhaps we can all see them.
We've still got answers coming in, so I'll give it another few seconds. So you should now see the results of the poll on your screen.
Thank you very much, everyone. So in the first question, we see that in terms of familiarity of participants, 55% responded somewhat familiar, 30% not familiar, and 15% very familiar. So we have a good breakdown of all categories. And in the second question, which regulations will have the biggest impact in your context? 34% responded EUDR, 21% CBAM, 24% CSDDD, and 21% say it's not so applicable to their work. Okay, so I think we have a good mix, and in terms of the familiarity, so I'll provide a quick overview for those who are not so familiar with these regulations before presenting the findings of the report. In terms of the regulations, it's good to see that many of you are interacting in different capacities with EUDR, CBAM, and CSDDD. So the content of the webinar will be very relevant for you. So let me just come back to my slides. And let me give you a brief overview of the three regulations. Just take a couple of seconds. So the EU Deforestation Regulation is an import control type of a measure. The main objective is to reduce deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions. And it is applicable to companies who are placing or making available selected products on the EU market. So the products, examples of these products are cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, and a few others. And they also apply to products that contain these commodities. So for example, in the case of cocoa, it would be chocolate. In the case of cattle, it would be leather and so forth. Requirements are that companies placing products on the EU market or actually exporting these products from the EU have to provide evidence of traceability and deforestation, being deforestation free. CBAM is another instrument, is also a type of an import tax with the main objective to prevent carbon leakage. Applies to importers of certain high carbon intensity goods to the EU. So examples would be cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminum, hydrogen, and hydrogen. And the requirement is to declare, for the importers of these products, to declare embedded emissions and surrender carbon certificates if needed. The EU CSDDD, the Due Diligence Directive, is a due diligence type of legislation. The objective is to promote responsible corporate behavior, and it doesn't apply to products, but applies to large EU and non-EU companies that meet certain employee and turnover thresholds, and requires them to conduct due diligence and develop and implement climate plans. So with this overview, let's take a few moments to discuss how these regulations actually affect emerging and developing countries. In the case of EUDR, we have in the report, actually for all these regulations, analyzed the explicit requirements applicable to companies from developing countries and the implicit requirements that are not explicitly mentioned in the text, but are likely to apply given the nature of global value chains, especially to the suppliers of affected of in-scope companies. So in the case of EUDR, the explicit requirements apply to all companies that actually place relevant products on the EU market. And this means that this will also affect exporters from developing countries of affected commodities, and implicitly their suppliers, who have to collect and report traceability data and invest in due diligence processes and compliance. In the case of CBAM, it's similar, also applies to companies importing relevant products, high carbon intensity products or commodities to the EU, who have to declare emissions embedded in imports and potentially pay carbon tax. In the same vein, suppliers are implicitly covered or affected by these regulations because they need to generate the data required to prove compliance, and also invest in different ways to comply, invest in new technology, data, and so forth. And in the case of due diligence directive, as already mentioned, the affected companies are not just EU companies, but non-EU companies that meet the thresholds. In one key threshold is a yearly turnover of at least 450 million euros in the EU market. And here the big discussion is the big issue is the impact on suppliers of these of all of these companies, including EU companies who need to provide evidence on compliance. They need to provide compliance assurances, invest in technology to reach compliance, and there are different types of compliance costs. So this would be the next slide. In the report, we've identified different types of compliance costs applicable, most of which are applicable to companies in developing countries. So to name a few examples, traceability and data management is one category. So for example, companies in developing countries need to implement systems to track carbon emissions throughout the supply chains. In the case of EUDR, systems to trace the origin of the products, and in the case of CSDDD, systems to trace to collect data about human rights and environmental risks in supply chains. Another type of compliance cost is auditing and verification. So, for example, CBAM requires third-party audits and verification of reported embedded emissions. And of course, there are other cost categories, like especially capacity building, given that every company that is affected by these regulations, including every supplier, needs to boost their capacity to be able to comply. So before I invite our esteemed panelists to share their perspectives, a brief note on the point of how these regulations affect SMEs. So a lot of these compliance costs, of course, affect SMEs disproportionately, given their limited financial resources and capacity. And so there is, from the interviews with stakeholders across multiple countries, it's clear that the challenges in the short term outweigh the opportunities in the, let's say, medium and long term. So the biggest challenges are high compliance costs, awareness gaps facing SMEs, limited resources in the face of increased cost requirements, and in some cases, market exclusion, for example, in the case of EUDR, where some smallholder farmers fear that they will be excluded from supply chains of buyers. On the other hand, there are many opportunities associated with access to new markets, stronger supplier relationships in supply chains, stronger positions if suppliers actually generate the required data, given the data now is becoming a commodity, and collaborative networks with large buyers. So let me now take a moment and invite Gülizar and Guillermo to the discussion. I would have two questions for you. I mean, of course, you can reflect on anything that was said, but the first question would be, what do you think is the most significant compliance cost in your country? So Gülizar, CBAM in Turkey, and Guillermo will be addressing EUDR in Peru. And how are companies and especially SMEs preparing for these regulations? So if you can reflect on that.
Actually, when we start with the compliance issues, it's not only one regulation that the company has to comply with. So it's not for an exporter. If they want to just enter into a one market, it's not only one regulation that requires compliance. They have to comply with other regulations as well. So when we see the compliance issues, we take almost three parts of the questions when we are dealing with especially the SME preparedness, because first we have to inform them about the regulation, what's coming, and then we have to force them to understand they have to change. So it is the second part. First, when there is a change, usually there is a rejection. And most of the companies, they, if they are, especially the SMEs, they wait until the deadline and they try to comply with whatever necessary. But these kind of regulations doesn't give you any time for the last minute changes, because in order to comply with CBAM, it's not only the reporting requirement, but in coming years, the requirements is lower your emissions. So you have to do some calculations now, and you have to make some financial, create some financial opportunities in order to make the investments, technological investment or other investments, and do the capacity building for your labor force as well. So it is change in many different areas. It is the mentality change area. Then you have to make the necessary changes in your production side. And then you have to get all the documents together, data, and you do the calculations, and you will need third-party verification or accreditation or some sort of third-party requirements. Then you have to get some services from them, and that requires another, that creates another financial burden. And after that, you have to be sure that any investment you make actually reduce your emissions in order to comply with CBAM. But in Turkey, what we see is, especially for the SMEs, after actually one report has been done by the World Bank Group for Turkey, for the EU circularity requirements, circular economy regulations, and how it will affect Turkish businesses. Then we saw that CBAM is not the biggest problem of the SMEs, actually. Productivity is the biggest problem of the Turkish SMEs. So they have to change their process or resource efficiency in order to lower the emissions, and which is actually better and effective than to do any investment in directly related to the CBAM. So if you cannot change the energy source in a short term, then you have to change how you use the energy, how you can prevent the losses in your energy use or resources, your chemicals, your water use, or your emissions to the environment, and how can you deal with all these efficiency problems together with dealing with your labor force as well, because you have to change your labor force, their capacity, and you have to educate them as well. So it is related to the environmental problems, but it's not purely an environmental problem. You have to get into the mentality that any emissions you're dealing with, whether it's GHG emissions or your water emissions or chemicals emissions, anything coming out of your facilities, actually your loss. So you have to analyze what you are losing when you are producing something, and you have to analyze where to invest. So as a government, we are trying to inform companies on these kind of issues, because when there is a huge information wave in some of the regulations like CBAM, it creates some sort of mentality that they have to do something related directly to the CBAM, but it's not the case. So to be effective in their financial resources as well, they have to learn how to lower their emissions in an effective way. So there are some technological research in Turkey as well. We have some specialized working groups, and in a sectoral base, they actually put on some roadmaps in some sectors, saying that what kind of investments, technological changes or other things will lower your losses, actually create effectiveness, and also it will affect your emissions as well. So if the companies follow these kind of directions, it will be better that they will invest in the correct direction rather than some companies direct them in through the one regulation, compliance of the one regulation. So it is not only the reporting problem. We are talking about now some sort of reporting requirements by the EU. But in order to report something, you have to do some changes first. So it's not only how I can fill up this kind of calculations, Excels, or some sort of reports, it is better to give some information to the companies to sit back and to learn what kind of requirements is necessary in order to enter into this market, rather than only focusing on one regulation. Just see what kind of changes as a whole is coming from this market, as well as you mentioned in your presentation, what kind of mentality changes waiting for us in the whole world as well. So not only the EU, but other parts of the world and their markets and their rules will change. So we have to prepare our SMEs accordingly to this kind of changes in order to make them resilient.
Thank you very much, Gulizar. So I take a couple of points from you. First one is it's not just about one regulation, CBAM, but multiple regulations. The other one is that maybe the CBAM has triggered the discussion about more systemic changes, started with the reporting requirements. At the end of the day, it's about changing business processes, improving resource efficiency, and investing into labor force. Thank you very much. I hope I got the points right. Guillermo, would you like to reflect on Peru?
Sure. Thanks, Jana. I think I would like to split my answer in maybe two parts. One, related compliance costs that are more concrete operationals, and a little bit also on more general costs that come about because the way these regulations are set up. As Jana said, we've been working mostly in Peru, but also in other countries in Latin America. And my reflections go about how the EUDR is being implemented, especially in coffee and cocoa, right, which are the commodities that are more important for Peru. In terms of compliance costs, operational costs for exporters, right now, the most important cost is probably the geolocalization requirement, no? The need to generate information, either a point or a polygon, about all the plots of land from where they source their cocoa or coffee. And this is a big endeavor because if you think about it, an average exporter in Peru can have anything from hundreds to tens of thousands of suppliers, right? So you have to, and these suppliers are not concentrated geographically, they're in different regions, they are small. So in order to generate the information about the geolocalization of each plot of land, you have to cover a lot of land. Sometimes you don't know right now where your suppliers are because you don't source through them directly, but through some intermediaries, right? Some intermediaries have that information. So for both exporters in Peru and Latin America, I think the geolocalization, getting the geolocalization data is the biggest operational cost to EUDR. And that is also closely followed by traceability, right? To set up these traceability systems to be able to track the cocoa, coffee, or palm oil from the plot of land to the container ship to the EU is also a big cost for them. But this is a dynamic issue. No? Right now, those are like the big fires that they're trying to put out. In the medium term, we know that they will need to work with smallholders to do audits, to do some verification, and to do all this remediation that is needed. So that will also be a big cost for exporters, for everyone. The supply chain changed. Right now, maybe it's not as relevant because they're focusing on getting the localization and traceability right. And in terms of the some issues that also impose some cost on exporters and actors in the supply chains, one big issue is that exporters deal with many buyers in the EU, right? So what they're getting right now is many different requirements in terms of not of the, let's say, the technicality of the geolocalization data, because that's set up in the regulation, but different EU importers might have different due diligence systems, different IT systems where you need to upload the data, and different guidelines, right? So an exporter a Peruvian exporter, for instance, might work with 5 or 15 EU importers. So they will have to not only collect all this data and put it together in a nice system, but also tailor that information so it can go to different due diligence systems for the European buyers. That is also a big issue for them. And I would like to maybe end this answer with one big issue that we see from the regulation so far has been also the lack of clarity on some particular issues, right? And that creates a lot of uncertainty for exporters. Issues like legality, the EU has done a great job publishing guidelines and frequently asked questions, but exporters in Peru and most countries who produce these commodities still has questions, very detailed questions about what constitutes, for instance, some legality issues, what due diligence systems, minimum requirements would be for due diligence systems and for traceability. And so when there's not a clear answer to these questions, they don't know how to act. And they're also approached by many companies who claim that have EUDR compliant systems, but they don't know who to believe because there's not a clear answer to some of these questions. So I think that's an area where we all development partners can work on it. But thanks, and back to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Guillermo. Perfect. So I think some very good points around the short-term cost related to EUDR for the geolocalization of the plots of lands and traceability. In the medium term, the need to actually put in place to deal with the smallholder farmers, train them, put in place remediation systems. But also at present, the challenge for many exporters to deal with the lack of clarity, legal clarity around some of these requirements, which probably is quite challenging for many actors. So maybe let's slowly segue to the next section, where we would like to map, in the case of Turkey and Ivory Coast and Peru, some of the main reforms that were implemented to adapt to the regulations, but also the challenges. So I'll start with a brief overview of the adaptation reforms or measures taken in Turkey and Ivory Coast. Gülizar, please feel free to add if I'm missing something, and Guillermo, feel free to then add on Peru, of course. But these two are based on case studies that are featured in the report. So what have the respective governments in these two countries done to adapt swiftly and to react to the regulations? So in the case of CBAM in Turkey, a key milestone was the development of the Green Deal Action Plan, which was launched briefly after the EU Green Deal was announced, and basically set an agenda for Turkey's green transition and alignment with EU legislation, but also in general with environmental legislation globally. As part of this initiative, the government put in place several working groups. One of them was the Green Deal Working Group that also had the task to analyze CBAM and its impacts on the economy and to propose policy options. And one of the results was the establishment of a national emissions trading system, which was a key reform to actually be able to reduce the cost of CBAM. Since the CBAM regulation allows recognition or the reduction of CBAM cost in other ETS systems that are aligned with the EU ETS system. So currently the government is putting down the legal framework for this, which is referred to the climate law. However, or not, sorry, in terms of the private sector and donors, these were also important actors in this process. So not only did large companies and SMEs participate in many discussions of this working group, but many have made major announcements around investments into renewable energy, green hydrogen, electric furnaces, like, for example, the Oya Group, which is a major steel producer in Turkey, but also companies like Siemens are investing into carbon reduction measures and providing free software for their SME suppliers on how to measure carbon emissions. Policy advocacy has been very important. Organizations like YASET, the Turkish International Investors Association, has been a very active agent in this process and supported the feedback to the climate law and other reforms. And of course, donors, there are some examples here, like, for example, the EBRD and the World Bank have been quite involved. The EBRD in the case of CBAM and the World Bank in terms of supporting incentive schemes for SMEs and their green transition. In the case of EUDR in Ivory Coast, the key reform was the establishment of the national traceability system, which is still being finalized. The necessity of this system is in ensuring that all farmers are actually part of the traceability system, not just those that are already supplying to exporters, directly to exporters or international buyers, but everyone, to ensure inclusion, and also the mapping of protected areas to make sure that farmers and exporters know on which farms are actually considered safe and meet the deforestation-free requirement. In terms of private sector and donors in Ivory Coast, all international companies sourcing cocoa in Ivory Coast already have their own digital traceability systems. So that is very helpful. But at the same time, there is the challenge that also Guillermo was referring to before, that many, for example, cooperatives supplying to these farmers have to report under different systems. And this produces a major red tape and is an issue given the limited capacity of many cooperatives. And of course, international players like IFC have been building the capacity of cooperatives to ensure EUDR compliance through different training programs. Now on the challenges, and the challenges are honestly many, perhaps more than the reforms. But here are just to name a few. So I think in both cases, stakeholders in the countries from public-private sector experience reform delays. I mean, the reforms are complex, take consultations of many stakeholders, and each country has experienced some form of a funding gap. I think in the case of Ivory Coast, the rollout of a national traceability system that involves around 900,000 cocoa households is a challenging task, given that it requires physical visits of the farmers, and the government has been faced with a major funding issue. In the case of Turkey, I think the issue is more around how to ensure that a private sector successfully embarks on a green transition along the lines of what Gülizar was mentioning. So really investing in new technologies, new business processes, and how to align incentive schemes with this objective and ensure that they don't distort markets. Private sector, on the other hand, again, is facing a lot of regulatory uncertainty because many laws are new or take time to pass. And of course, they need to navigate this time through their own creative resources and consultations with the government as much as possible, high compliance cost, and SMEs facing the barriers which were mentioned before. And in the case of Ivory Coast, the big challenge for private sector is really on the cooperatives and smallholder farmers side, given the lack of interoperability of the reporting systems and the fact that many cooperatives not only don't have the technology, but don't have the human resources to actually manage transitions like this. So from the research, and to conclude on my side, I think the key kind of takeaways or lessons learned from these countries, but also a few others that were interviewed, are as follows. What is really important for a successful adaptation is proactive government action along the lines of initiatives like Turkey's Green Deal Action Plan. The second is, to the extent possible, clear and consistent regulations. And even in times when regulations are not clear, ensure proper communication with private sector so that they are aware of the latest developments. Technological solutions to ensure traceability, emissions monitoring. This will be a big topic in these two regulations and also in the case of CSDDD. SME support, another one, providing financial and technical assistance to be able to comply with regulations. Financial support for green transition on a bigger scale in terms of provided innovative. What will be important is the provision of innovative funding mechanisms, blended finance, green bonds, to really manage larger green transitions in both countries. Private sector leadership has also been a key part of the reform processes, as mentioned in the case of Turkey. But it's really in many cases, it's good to support these large companies taking new groundbreaking initiatives because they really drive the innovation in their respective sectors. I think Siemens is a good example of that in Turkey. And collaboration among stakeholders, I think, is a big issue, given that in both cases, there are so many stakeholders involved in these reform processes and NGOs, and it's extremely important to bring everyone on the same page to ensure effective adaptation and progress. So this is quite on a general level, but let me again hand over to Pilizar and Guillermo, and I would like to ask you the following question. What lessons have you learned from your respective experiences working in the two countries, and what was the biggest challenge and how did you solve it? Yes, please, maybe one of you can start, whoever feels.
Actually, this is not a new process for us because we've been doing this since 1995 with the Customs Union Agreement with the EU, because EU has been the trendsetter for all kinds of technical regulations, not only in the climate change area, but for the technical regulations and standard setting area as well. So when we start harmonizing EU technical legislation in 1997, we faced almost similar problems. So we've been there, we've done that. So, and some lessons have learned. As Guillermo mentioned, now we are facing with the inflation of new regulations, inflation of consultants who doesn't know anything about it, really. And there are some actually more gray areas this time because all regulations now EU is putting into force or making the drafts actually interrelated to each other. That's why I mentioned it's not only the CBAM, it's not only the EUDR, it's not only this and that, because EU is now decided this is a climate change issue, but they will solve this problem with the competitiveness problem. So when you link climate issues with the competitiveness, it means you will change a lot of rules about the entry into the market. So, for example, if Ivory Coast or Peru cannot comply with EUDR as Turkey, using these inputs in my products to export EU, I cannot buy anything from Peru or Ivory Coast. So it's not only my compliance, it is my trade partners' compliance as well. What we are facing now, even the EU producers that exporting some inputs to the Turkish companies regarding the CBAM, they think they are not affected by CBAM because they have ETS. But it's not the case, because as a Turkish producer or manufacturer, I need the precursor emissions to put into my report. So most of the emissions in the CBAM sectors, such as aluminum or iron or steel, comes from the precursor. So EU producer has to has a product emission, prepare the CBAM report and send it to me, and I have to add my final product emissions, and when I'm selling to EU back, then I will have the final report. Now, one of the challenges we are facing, not only the other countries have to be informed about these changes, but EU producers, EU exporters has to be aware of their regulation as well, such as EUDR as well, because Peru or Ivory Coast does not sell only to EU, or the companies in that countries facing EUDR requirements, they will not be facing or dealing with the EU companies. They will be dealing Turkish companies or other companies they are exporting to, and using these inputs into their products and exporting final product to the EU. I will be, my companies will be asking Peruvian companies, where is your EUDR compatibility reports or where certificate or such and so on. So these kind of requirements not only affects companies directly exporting to the EU, it affects the trade between other countries as well. So we are, as a Turkish government, in our bilateral meetings with all our trade partners, we put Green Deal issues into the agenda now. So it is not only CBAM, it's not only EUDR, it's not only the corporate sustainability requirements, because when you say the corporate sustainability requirements, then you have to have some sort of supply chain report system. So that's why big Turkish private companies has to comply with all of the regulations, and they have to take the lead in order to change their supply chain as well. If they cannot inform their supply chain, or if they cannot support their supply chain, and mostly the SMEs, their supply chain consists from the SMEs, so they cannot buy any raw material, or they cannot buy any semi-finished goods from them. So it is a challenge for the Turkish government. It is a challenge for the big companies as well. We have to sort of come together, what we do in our working group as well, because we have to bring all the companies, regardless of their size, bring together to make them understand they have to strengthen their links with each other. So it's not the issue of price anymore. When you are buying an input, what was happening, you will ask what kind of price and what they can make on the price, and you will be asking on some standards or certificates. Now you have to ask them their production line, how they are producing these kind of products. So what kind of labor laws they have in their countries. If they are hindering some sort of labor laws under the ILO, or if they are hindering some sort of creating some sort of environmental problems when they are producing something, I have to know in order to be in the supply chain, green supply chain. Otherwise, my exporters cannot sell anything. So Turkish government, one of our policy areas is to inform our trade partners what is coming in EU regulations, what my producers or my importers will be asking from their exporters as well. Because in most of the countries, exporters are not the producers. So they have to go back to their producers as well. Like you said, they have to go door to door to inform their maybe this micro SMEs about the changes in the EU law.
Mhm.
And they are living in their village. They have no idea what we are talking about. So it is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. It's not only the Turkish SMEs, but our trade partners, SMEs, we have to inform.
Thank you very much, Gulizar. I think there is no need to summarize these points and the additional requirements and kind of mandates for the Turkish Ministry of Trade to actually help private sector deal with the requirement around supply chain transparency and securing the data to ensure compliance. So this is indeed a very big and complex topic. And Guillermo, would you like to reflect on your experience?
Sure. No, there are lots of lessons related to EUDR, right? And I realize that there are nuances about the difference in the countries and the sectors, the way that the cocoa sector in West Africa is structured different than in Latin America. Working with soybean is probably different than working with cocoa and coffee. But I think there are three main lessons that I think cut across commodities and countries in terms of EUDR, right? And the first one is the role of the private sector. EUDR, like most of these new environmental regulations, really put the private sector at the center of the regulation. In the EUDR is the EU importer who has all the legal requirements. They are the ones driving the implementation of the regulation, right? So in terms of a country trying to figure out what to do there, I would say the first thought will be to put the private sector right there at the center of this issue, and talk to EU importers, talk to exporters in their own countries, and ask them what is their problem and how do we solve that problem. That will be the starting point for me, right? I mean, otherwise we run the risk of doing a lot of things that will not be useful, or doing a lot of very, very good work that countries governments are doing everywhere, but because there's like one tiny detail that was not discussed with the private sector or with EU importers, ends up not being used for EUDR compliance, right? So that will be, for me, put the private sector right in the center of the agenda and try to solve their problem. Will be the first lesson learned. I think the second lesson learned is that most of the solutions will have to do modular and interoperable, right? There are a lot of little things happening in most countries, sometimes by government, sometimes by donors, private sectors, NGOs. Some are working on traceability, some are working on geolocalization, on the legal framework. So this idea that, and for a lot of them, they think that their solution will be the big bang solution that everyone will adopt, right? I will have my app that will do traceability. It's so good that everyone will adopt. In most cases, that will not be true, right? Like exporters who have, for instance, their own supply, part of their supply certified by Rainforest Alliance or RSPO, will continue using those solutions. Maybe for the indirect suppliers, they will see if there's any government database or traceability solution that could help. We'll work with some cooperatives that have an app developed by an NGO. So there's this need really to be aware that we're not going to solve this problem with one big solution, right? There are very different pieces, and these pieces need to work together and be able to converse together, especially because a lot of this stuff will have to be digital, right? So this interoperability between systems, between private and public traceability systems, making sure that the data collected not only by cooperatives, by the government and private sector can be transferred between systems and move up the value chain all the way to the EU importer, and that fulfills the requirement of the EU importers. I think that's also a key requirement of any solution to work on EUDR, right? In the third issue, it's the third recommendation or lesson learned that I can provide is that there's a need to start and keep alive a dialogue between all stakeholders, right? Governments, exporters, producers, EU importers, EU authorities, because as Gulisar and you, Jana, have mentioned, there are a lot of gray areas, right? And this is part of any regulation that comes into place. A lot of things will be clarified as the regulation is actually implemented and people hit practical problems, right? Not only on the exporter side, on the EU side too. So there are a lot of gray areas right now, but the best thing of dealing with that type of uncertainty is to have an open dialogue, right? Where if there's an issue, exporters in Peru, in Colombia, in Cote d'Ivoire, and Turkey can reach out to EU importers, to EU authorities, and discuss it and see how that issue will be solved, right? If you don't talk to EU importers, you don't see the challenges that they see coming, or you don't see what the EU Commission is thinking about implementing to solving some of those issues, right? So this need to keep engaging and keep this dialogue happening, because there will be issues that will need to be resolved, right? I think that's another key recommendation that it's needed to work on these new regulations, especially EUDR. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, especially for the last point around the dialogue among the different stakeholders and bringing in the EU stakeholders to the table, since a lot of the open questions will be resolved on the go and as things get implemented. So I think we're slowly moving to the last part of the presentation. And that one is dealing with recommendations for development partners. Since this has been one of the main objectives of the report, to actually provide some ideas and thoughts around how development partners can support affected country, government, and private sector in adaptation. So in the report, there are three main areas of recommendations. The first one is taking stock of knowledge gaps. The second one is engaging in international policy and multi-stakeholder fora. And the third one is the provision of country-level support. In terms of the first one, I think one realization for me as I was working on this research is that different development partners are working on different regulations, already launching pilot programs or projects, and there are still a lot of knowledge gaps and maybe the missing value of sharing these lessons learned from these projects. So the main recommendation to the development community would be to actually take stock of what is already out there and build on that. And some more specific topics to research would be understanding more the sectoral impacts of these regulations, understanding successful adaptation strategies for SMEs in the different contexts. How can they successfully adapt? How can they be supported? The third one will be role of technology in compliance. I think this was mentioned several times today, that technology will be important across these regulations in different forms. And the question is how to make it work and how to make sure that the human capital is also ready for its implementation. And the last one is taking stock of financial mechanisms that support adaptation to these regulations and the agendas that they bring. So I think Lisa mentioned it's not just about the regulations, but bigger topics, but how can we really mobilize and align the current instruments with the new agendas. regulatory agendas. The second theme around engaging in international policy and multi-stakeholder fora is more an invitation or reminder for many development partners to really be part of the international policy dialogue on these topics, for once because they undertake many analyses and work with country stakeholders and can represent their views in this policy fora, but also because they have a big say in ensuring or supporting the coherence of the different regulations being coming up in the US, in the EU, in Asia, and private sector is concerned. Also, large companies are concerned about the different terminology being used, the different types of due diligence requirements being used. So I think there is definitely a case for working on a direction towards coherence across these countries in their legislation. The second thought is on multi-stakeholder initiatives. So development partners might learn from existing initiatives of the EU, like the EU Sustainable Cocoa Initiative or the EU Responsible Minerals Partnerships, which already bring together industry and government stakeholders and have been successful in promoting adaptation in their respective fields. And there is perhaps a case in replicating or supporting the replication of these initiatives to other commodities covered by the regulations. And the last one is advocacy around green funding, which I think is somewhat self-explanatory. And the third bucket, country-level support, I think is the most of most interest, perhaps also to the participants of this webinar. So the recommendation is to prioritize urgent responses to the most affected countries by EUDR and CBAM, because these are the most urgent regulations. There are already tools looking at the exposure of different countries to these regulations and exposure of their exports. So it's not so difficult to identify those that need this support. The second one is building awareness in these countries. One key finding of the report was that in many countries, also talking to, for example, the ACP secretariats, I was told very clearly that these countries are not ready, and the awareness is still not as it should be in terms of the content, the requirements, and how to actually implement reforms and develop reform roadmaps. And the last one is, of course, designing policy mixes and roadmaps to address the structural issues. So on the one hand, I think the first point was more about the urgent support in the short term, making sure that we minimize the damage that might happen. But of course, we need to start working on the structural issues around reducing carbon intensity of exports of developing countries, improving supply chain traceability, innovating funding mechanisms for green transition, and so forth. So this would be really for medium and long-term type of agenda. So before we open it to Q&A, I would still like to ask Gülizar and Guillermo one question, namely, what do you think is the most urgent action for development partners, let's say in the next year, to support transition or adaptation to these regulations? So, Gülizar, I know in your case it's not just about CBAM, but maybe this is an opportunity to express a wish list in the next year, what you need.
Two main issues that I would like to raise, that most of the countries, when they are facing such big changes, it is important to follow the regulatory changes in a draft stage. So when EU or international organizations, when they're trying to draft some regulations, it is better to act on it when it's on the draft stage, because when it passes as a regulation, it's not easy to add your voice into the piece of regulation. Because as Guillermo mentioned, most of the countries has different kind of legislations, legal systems, and also different kind of way of doing when they are doing business. So its cocoa producer or cocoa industry is different in Brazil or other countries. So they have to understand that they have to put all different kind of views into the international fora when such changes came into the WTO or other international mechanisms. Even the EU, when they are actually put something into the public consultation, we have to not only the public authorities, trade unions, exporters, manufacturers, technical people, scientists, they have to actually read that regulation and come up with a solution. It would ease the process because it's, as I mentioned, some of the solutions EU come up with is not only it's the sole solution to that problem. We can find better solutions. Second one is, as we saw at the COP29, most of the developed countries ready to push this kind of regulatory changes, but they are not ready to make necessary funding arrangements. So if we are dealing with the truly environmental issue, it's not that one country will make a change and then it will be okay. Because if most of the producing countries, developing countries or least developed countries cannot deal with the effects of the climate change, if they cannot transform themselves, their production methods, then there will be no change in the climate issues. So this is my second point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Guillermo, would you like to also reflect?
Sure. I think for the donor community, this might sound like very basic, but I think we can do a better job of coordinating, right? Like, as Gulizar said, there are little initiatives, and sometimes you don't figure out that someone is doing something on traceability that's super interesting until you meet them at like a random meet, right? But so this role of coordinating what is being done on EUDR, who's planning on doing what, who already has a solution or like a key technical part, I think is key. I think this coordination should not only be among donors, but also involve other institutions from the private sector and NGOs too, right? I think there's a lot of knowledge in certification bodies, Rainforest Alliance, RSPO, Fair Trade. If you talk to them, you realize what is going on, what are the best solutions. A lot of NGOs do a lot of work on legality issues for forestry. Their input is super important. So having this big coalition of not only donors, right, but other people also from private sector, from civil society, to push some key messages. And I'm talking about EUDR, right? Like push some key messages that need to go through everyone in EUDR, right? Doesn't have to be a lot. Could be 2 or 3 big messages. What could those messages be? I think the first one I already mentioned, put private sector at the center, right? This is EU importers, and through them exporters and producers will have to comply with certain regulations. Putting them at the center, I think it's a key message that this coalition should push for. The other issues is on issues of legality, right? Like there's a lot of discussion because legality is a difficult issue to tackle. There are a lot of gray areas, but we know a couple of things that have been already clarified by the EU, right? Like, for instance, that the legality issue deals with the place of production, right? So you don't have to look at the whole value chain for it. That if the local regulations or laws don't require you to have a land title to commercialize your products, then as part of the EUDR, you don't need to prove that you have a land title, right? Those basic issues that have been, in my view, solved, we need to push to simplify the work that needs to be done on legality, because there's a lot of work to be done on legality, right? So if we can tell them, look, these issues have already been solved, we don't need to go deeper, that will help reassign some resources to the issues where it still have to be debated, right? So I think creating this coalition of the willing, if you mind, pushing for 2 or 3 key messages, right, will be super useful for everyone working on EUDR, right? And another thing that I mentioned was this building these communication channels, and especially here, we as development partners can play that role, right? Like German cooperation can reach out to German importers, French cooperation to French importers, and so on and so forth. One of the things that we've been trying to do at the World Bank was to bring together associations of EU importers of some of these commodities to countries, so they can explain how they're planning on dealing, or what they're telling their members of how to deal with EUDR, right? Like the European Cocoa Association, for instance, has developed a draft protocol for due diligence for EUDR, right? Like, so that type of information, facilitating that type of information to move from Europe to countries, to exporters and producers in producing countries, I think it's a great thing that we can do as a development partner community. Back to you.
Thank you very much. So a couple of great points from both sides, including making the tools and the answers to the questions more available to the relevant communities, supporting coalitions, bringing private sector at the center of the discussion, understanding their needs and addressing them swiftly. And then, of course, the request perhaps to the lawmakers in the EU and other originating economies to involve affected parties in the development of these regulations and aligning the funding with the requirements for private sector, but of course affecting developing country governments as well. So I think with this we have concluded the presentation part. So I would like to hand over to Pilar. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Jana, Gülizar, and Guillermo, for this excellent overview and discussion, and also like a very practical, practical view of what it actually means on the ground to comply with these new environmental regulations. I think it's all quite abstract until we hear from Gülizar and from Guillermo on, well, once the rubber hits the road, what does this actually mean to implement? And it's all very new, and I'm sure we all have many questions about it. I see questions in the Q&A. I think one of them is, maybe we don't know yet, but it would be good to get your take first, Jana, because you talked to so many stakeholders, on a question from Paulo. If Paulo is still there, he asks a little bit about, is there anyone left behind? Paulo, do you want to come in? I don't know, Ella, if you can unmute Paulo.
I think Paulo is not in the call anymore.
Okay, so I'll just channel the question. Is it too early to tell who, if these regulations are disproportionately affecting either a sector, either a country, either a type of company? Jana, I don't know if that was a concern raised when you were doing stakeholder consultations.
So I think for once there are already some tools by the World Bank or the ITC, for example, on CBAM or EUDR, estimating the exposure or effect on certain countries' exports to the EU. Yes, so from that you can derive which countries are relatively more affected than others. Of course, these are simulations, but could be a starting point. In terms of the size of companies, I think so all companies are affected. And I also talked to, for example, Intel, the major multinational corporations, and to the head of the global advocacy. And the feedback was, look, we also don't have unlimited resources. Yes, because they are affected by multiple regulations at the same time. So when you just look at minerals, yes, I think so it's a little bit crazy for them as well. But of course, multinational corporations have more resources than SMEs. So yes, I think if we try to help or financially to someone, I think SMEs are the ones who need more support. But the real answer is more in promoting collaboration and building these coalitions of the different stakeholders and finding ways to make the best out of what is. So, but quantitatively, I'm not aware of any study that would assess the impact on a particular size of a company, but from the qualitative feedback was that yes, SMEs definitely, first of all, we know very little about how they are coping, and second of all, that is a big concern, because if there is silence, probably nothing is happening, and this might be an issue. And in terms of sectors, so I think, CBAM and EUDR specify certain commodities and apply to these commodities, in some cases to their precursors or downstream products. So that can be mapped. But effectively, when you take CSDDD, it applies across all global value chains. So, so I think that nobody will be excluded from this transition. That's my take on this. But of course, with more research, perhaps we could have a more nuanced answer. In case other panelists would like to add something, please compliment, correct me.
Maybe I can add to this discussion by saying that because EU is changing a whole lot of regulation, not only the CBAM or others. So, for example, they will change the batteries regulation. It will affect the automotive and white goods and anything it's puts batteries in it. So they will change. They change the packaging regulation. So it requires recycled input in the packaging. So in order to put recycled goods, you have to have some sort of industrial emissions directive to produce these recycled goods from the waste. So it's not you're gonna take the waste and prepare some sort of input, secondary material, put into your textile, automotive, batteries, packaging. It's not enough. Your facility has to comply with industrial emissions directive, which requires you have to comply with best available techniques, which requires you have to have a new technology. So you're not exporting to the EU. You're not actually, you're a small company producing some sort of packaging. But anybody who wants this material has to come to you, ask, okay, show me you are complying with the industrial emissions directive. So in order to solve that, as Guillermo mentioned, big companies in Turkey, they started investing into their supply chain. For example, white goods company, which is a leader company and they are exporting a lot, they started to support one of the packaging companies in order to differ from the foam packaging, which creates environmental hazards as well. So they give the money, they lend the money to this packaging company to come up with a very strong paper recycled some sort of packaging to hold these white goods. So it has to be light, it has to be strong, and if it's possible, it has to be reusable. And it has to be recycled as well. So these packaging companies, they don't have enough resources to do this kind of production or R&D. But this white goods company, they thought it's feasible to invest in them in Turkey rather than buying from another country, importing into Turkey, because it will be, it's not only, they will secure their packaging as well in Turkey. Otherwise, they will be importing, but other countries, they will be asking some sort of complied packages. So maybe in next shipment, they won't be able to buy this kind of complied goods from another country as well. So this is why it's too complex for everybody, not only the public authorities, but as Guillermo said, it is up to, and mostly the burden is on the private companies to decide on how they are gonna secure their supply chain. So it is, so no one is actually safe from the transformation. It affects everybody.
I think if I might very quickly, yeah, I think in terms of the EUDR, the most exposed that might be left out is all the small holders that are unorganized and are part of the indirect supply chains, right? That they don't have the direct link with the exporter. Because what's going on in Peru and other countries is that the exporter has some suppliers that have long-term relationships, or they provide inputs, technical assistance. They know where they are. They know they have fidelity relationships, so they can invest something to do geolocalization, put them in the traceability apps, push them into Rainforest Alliance, RSPO, etc. And so that's the low-hanging fruit for them, right? But then those suppliers who are 2-3 intermediaries removed from the exporter, and you will have to geolocalize thousands of them in order to fill a container of cocoa or coffee. That's a very different proposition, right? So those are the producers that are at the risk of getting left out by these type of regulations, and where I think most of the efforts should be directed to. No, thanks.
Thank you. So we don't have much more time, and I'll be a little bit self-serving regarding the questions. I see that Siobhan puts in an interesting question, and that it's related to other questions that we've received from Ando and others on, well, what kind of support is there to implement these regulations? So I think I'd like to direct this question first to Gülizar, because Turkey is a little bit ahead of the curve in trying to implement and in supporting. So when you first started, Gülizar, what did you look out for? Okay, these regulations are here. What support is there from the government to implement them? And what did you find? Has that situation evolved as well? Or was it just up to you?
Actually, first of all, we changed some of the regulations in order to actually support the companies with their green transition. Because when government gives some sort of incentives, even though it's not big in terms of financial contribution, maybe it's the small amount, but it directs the companies towards some sort of transition. So we changed some of the regulation, saying that if you invest in these areas, mostly in the environmental issues, like recycling businesses, or if you do something with the renewable energy, or if you invest in some sort of wastewater treatment, such and so on, then we will accept your company as a, we say we have the regional investment opportunities. Least developed regions usually gets the most governmental support, but we said these kind of environmental investments will be deal with under the least developed region. So we will give the most incentive to these companies as if they are in the least developed region of the Turkey. Then we started preparing with these roadmaps for the technological needs and decarbonization needs for the CBAM sectors. So as Jana mentioned, OYAK, their investment project actually stems from this decarbonization roadmap, because it shows in iron and steel industry or aluminum industry or cement industry which way to go to the companies. They took these kind of roadmaps to the actually IFIs, saying that, okay, the need is here, priorities are here, I will invest in such and such areas in order to decarbonize my production. So it was easy for them to get some sort of international finance as well. Second part of our job is to give companies to prepare these kind of investment projects as well, because they need some sort of technical support in order to prepare projects as well, green projects. So as a government, we give some consultancy incentives to the companies to prepare their decarbonization or green or digital transition projects. Then we will send these projects to the Turkish Exim Bank or other banks, so they can actually invest or support their projects in order to decarbonize whole industry. So it is a internet-based system. They upload their request there. First part of the project, they get the technical assistance, and then they prepare the project proposal, and banks get these project proposals and offer their financial offer to the companies, and company accepts, then they start with the project.
Pilar, I think you need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Thank you, Jana. So I think what we're hearing is really when you started implemented, you used the tools that were available in the Turkish government and not necessarily support that came from outside to implement these regulations, which I think is where a lot of the questions are coming from. And I guess that brings me maybe to the last closing question for Jana and Guillermo is, so we see that SMEs are likely to be the most impacted. Are there already like specific guidance, technical assistance, and material out there just for them? And is that something that the international development partners should be working to support or produce, or is there a more pressing need right now on the international development partner role? What should we be working on right now to support the compliance? Maybe Guillermo, we can start with you since you've been on the ground listening to our clients.
Yes. No, and I'll speak specifically to the case of Peru, where these tools are being developed, right? Like there are many initiatives from different ministries to help come up with guidance on how to do due diligence, how to get the geolocalization data. So at least in Peru, that work is being done. Some of the donors are also working, especially with cooperatives, trying to set up like due diligence systems, traceability systems, digital tools to kind of like gather the data and move it up the supply chain. But that's a key role for the development partners. No, I think we should also be clear that it's not all guidance, right? There's a lot of needs for financing because cooperatives, small producers will have to invest in physical infrastructure to segregate their supply chains if they cannot can get their supplies from farmers that all comply with EUDR. They will need to invest in some IT systems to kind of like obtain and manage the data that they collect, how they move it up to different buyers. So there's a lot of IT infrastructure too that needs to be put in place. And of course, people on the ground, they need people on the ground to do the geolocalization, do the audits, the verification. So I think there's a lot of we can do in capacity building, but also not to forget that there's a big financing gap there too, no?
Yes, and I think from my perspective, I think exactly doing what you said, Pilar. So the answer to your question is yes. I think it would be useful if development partners could actually take stock of existing tools that were developed in Turkey, in Peru, and in all other countries where, for example, DCED members are working. And I would also see EU as a very important partner in this endeavor because they have also their own ongoing initiatives and repositories of information. On CSDDD, they are launching the EU help desk. So I think what they have done recently is actually solicit information from public-private sector NGOs asking what do you need actually to comply with CSDDD and what do you have and are willing to share. So I think also bringing them to a project like this would be very helpful. And I see also in the chats there are different tools being shared. I think this is a great starting point for an initiative like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jana. And yes, thanks to our colleague from DG INPA who has copied some useful links also in the chat box for us on that, particularly on EUDR. So we're 10 minutes over time. I want to thank everyone for the presentations, for attending. We had over 170 people attending. I especially want to thank Jana for the great work. This is new to all of us. She really did a great job in reaching out and getting different perspectives. We hope you enjoy the research note that Ella will share. She'll share the link if she hasn't already. Oh yes, it is launched. Wonderful, Ella. Thank you. Thank you very much to Gülizar for sharing the experiences of Turkey. That is really leading the way. Already seeing what the challenges are, and of course to Guillermo for sharing the experiences specifically in Peru with EUDR, but I'm sure that he's going to be doing this in many other countries. And I think that part of what we heard is that collaboration and lesson sharing is key. So we hope to circle back in probably a year's time and hear how things have been going somewhere else. I want to thank our colleague Ella Duffy from DCED who helped produce this webinar. Thank you, Ella, for the support. And thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it, and the recording will be available on the DCED YouTube. Thank you very much.